All right. Uh, I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. Honorable Chair, we think it is extremely regrettable that that certain sacred practices that indigenous people often had are being profited upon by many corporations and people who just want to make money out of it. We think that the framing for this debate comes in three ways. Number one, understand that as per stated per the info slide, oftentimes these spiritual wellness practices draw heavy inspiration from indigenous cultures, right? The standard then in this debate is number one, where we protect these vulnerable actors, right? Take note that they are already being disenfranchised, as more often than not, they have often been the subject of a lot of misrepresentation from a lot of other ways, such as the media. Here, we also want to protect the people who want to subscribe to these particular types of practices for reasons I will be stating later on. The problem here is that once again, these practices are being heavily misunderstood because of profit incentivization by these companies. Now, we think that this is something regrettable because, as you will see again, it is something that has become harmful to a lot of other people, and why our counterfactual is better. So, the stance here, just to be clear, is that we're okay with these practices not being as popular and not being as widespread nowadays because their culture is not for everybody's enjoyment and it is not for people's profit. The counterfactual then is that the practices are likely to continue without commercialization and that the practices are likely to continue within these indigenous groups anyways. All right. Before I begin with my substantives, I'll take a POI. Three, two, one. All right. So the first argument comes as at cultural appropriation. The framing here is again, as per stated, these practices are oftentimes very derivative of these indigenous practices. The analysis here comes in comes in four ways. Number one is that people don't actually appreciate these cultures, right? They cannot say that hey, commercializing it has made it more accessible and more well known by other people, and so they can appreciate the culture of these indigenous people. I don't think this is the case because it will not happen when profit or money becomes involved. Entrepreneurs tend to misconstrue the original purpose of these practices in the first place in order to create a profit from it. They are likely to twist the original intentions behind the practices in order to appeal to consumers much more. This looks like practices such as legitimate prayers towards their deities being twisted so that people can find it appealing. People can say, "Oh wow, this particular type of practices is something that's very trendy nowadays. Maybe I should try it." We think that that is something that's already regrettable on our side. Next piece of analysis is why the subscribers of these spiritual practices or the commercialized ones, they often provide a terrible association towards the original practices in the first place. This often looks like young girls as seen on TikTok or Tumblr who are using these crystals to I don't know, do some manifestation or something. And these young girls have always been mocked for the things that they have liked. What happens here is that you are likely to turn it into a trend. You are likely to turn it into a fad instead of it being associated with indigenous people. And instead, people will associate it negatively with these people who bring it negative attention. The third piece of analysis is how it can end the beliefs and the practices of the culture anyways. So it is not very long term. And at a point in time that these traditions and culture doesn't work in the commercial market, people are obviously going to stop these practices and it would not work for everyone. And it is likely to happen because people are likely to deceive you into thinking that certain things like, rocks or crystals have certain effects which are not backed or proven by science, meaning that companies and people will always be profit driven. So the population and the awareness that and the appreciation that they get, even if there is any, is not really very long term. And it creates a bad image on the original sources of the cultures anyways. The association becomes messed up when it happens because indigenous people have already been misconstrued so many times already, especially in forms such as the media, and misinterpreting their sacred practices, something which is an important part of their own lives in order to achieve self-fulfillment, is just very bad and something which we again think is very regrettable in the principal level. The
Yeah,
second piece of argument, all right, go.
if there is a usage to it, why would people just not opt into it anymore or do further research into improving its quality in the end?
Yeah, that's going to be addressed later on in my substantives. Thank you. So the second piece of argument on why this commercialization is bad on the pragmatic level. Take note that people tend to make money off deception, which again may interfere with the actual meanings that are behind it. This means that, people generally just make crystals out of plastic just to capitalize on the idea that, hey, maybe this will do something. And people can say that this type of ritual or crystal provides X benefit when even if it may not. again, it's bad because you're already deceiving consumers without providing actual backing or actual research to back it up. And again, you misconstrue the cultures and traditions of these indigenous cultures. And once again, we think that this is once again bad because they cannot say that, hey, commercializing it will make it other people aware or appreciate the culture even. We think that this is bad because mostly the people who capitalize off of this are not the indigenous cultures themselves. Why? Because cultures, they do not actually want to spread their own culture. Their main incentive is to just preserve it. They just want to keep it going within their own indigenous group. They have no intention of spreading it or making or trying to propagate it as a trend, right? So again, the indigenous people don't necessarily want their culture to be practiced by everyone because it is something that's sacred to them and something which they might not want to see as something that's just a trend. Even if you do get more awareness, oftentimes what happens is that this is a dilution of the original practices, and it is not even something that the people of the community even want. Take note that they prefer to preserve their culture and aren't really interested in spreading them or proliferating them as much. Before I move on, I'll take the POI from opposition.
Recognize the only harmful instance you've given us as to how this culture has been made a trend is the crystal trend. The majority of things like Ayurvedic practices, where you go for things like acupuncture, is simply just incredibly popular. Why then do you only focus on this single example?
That's something that's really bad because what you've mentioned is a very outlier case. Acupuncture is something that may have brought appreciation to Chinese culture, but if you pay attention to things that are happening in the Philippines, you are getting Westerners, you are getting influencers that are trying to say that, hey, this is a culture or a practice that has been taken from this indigenous culture or this indigenous group, and is something that is something that's pretty good. What happens is that people tend to look past the fact that they are lifted or derivative of these indigenous people. What they are likely to do is that they are likely to view it as a trend. They are likely to say that, hey, this was started by this particular person, meaning that we should follow it. And this means that, again, you do not actually bring awareness to these indigenous groups. The way that the counterfactual would work is that if people like indigenous groups, again, if they want awareness brought towards their cause or towards their cultures, it's going to work in a different way. It's going to work itself into history books. It's going to work into responsible reporting like the media, and it's not going to be something that's profit incentivized. It is not going to work in a way that they're suddenly going to make merchandise of their particular culture. So what's happening here is that once again, as my partner will expound, there's often pseudoscience involved here in order to market it. So this means that these practices plays out often marketed as like a legitimate alternative to science or medicines. And this means that people will likely get harmed and prevent them from making informed decisions in the first place. We think that spiritual wellness is something that you just cannot buy from the market. The impact here of this entire case is that we prevent companies from deceiving impressionable people in the form of these consumers, and we also prevent them from erasing or rather diluting and infecting the original purpose or the original culture of these indigenous peoples. For all these reasons and more, I've never been more proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Let's now call on Leader of Opposition.
I just checking if I'm audible and visible.
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Yang Ming. I go by he and pronouns, and I prefer POIs given verbally. So you can just unmute and let me know when. Thank you so much. All right, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I think you can believe from me as a Chinese individual that we have a damn lot of cultural practices and spiritual wellness. It's quite abhorrent for side of proposition to just assume that all of these things have no value towards other people in society, and that something is just over commodified and commercialized by people on the ground. I think I have two pieces to set up, mainly to just take out most of the side of proposition's case in this debate. The first is on what these spiritual wellness practices look like, because like it often traditions from these indigenous communities with the intention for them to also heal and improve their community's wellness. It's not often just a faith symbol that you pray to a god. Dude, indigenous communities aren't really really that dumb and you can believe in me. They just don't really do it just because it's fun, but it actually brings benefit towards these individuals, which just frames out most of the case on side propositions saying that it's just not scientifically backed and that individuals will not really get benefit from it. You lead to further backlash towards these communities. It's also unstrategic for corporations to just frame it as something that's wellness and improves your own life without actually having much of a pragmatic outcome. But secondly, often we can see that there are still some risk to it in the generic version, just like smearing herbs down the body, using leeches or having garlic for illnesses. This is because the community inside is quite locked between themselves and they lack other avenues towards information that might improve these forms of quality, the quality of these types of practices and wellness. But secondly, what does our opposition support in this debate? I think I support two things. The first is just that, what does this look like? Because it often looks like you having people from other places, maybe the West, discovering these forms of practices when they actually go to the original places, or it looks like having people from these indigenous communities actually integrating and assimilating into the modern world and actually coming and sharing about their culture. Also, it often takes one to understand the nuanced nature of these cultures to realize its significance and have an incentive to sell. This is because it's important for these companies to market this as something very traditional so that you're able to actually legitimize it by using your knowledge of the culture. But secondly, commercialization also means selling in the market, creating a supply and advertising it in order to get people to buy into it. This adheres to current regulations and public perceptions towards things like making it secure, making it safe, and making sure that individuals are able to actually access it to the largest extent. I've just two responses to first proposition speech in this case, because they tell that it will lead to cultural appropriation because people don't necessarily appreciate the inherent value of these practices. I'm unsure why this is true because this is a commodity and a service that you sell to people on the ground. That means the way for people to subscribe into it in of itself is to know the usage and realize its importance before you actually try something like goat yoga. But it also doesn't really misrepresent it to the largest extent. It's an entirely new service and nobody really knows much about it. So it's important for corporations and the people who actually want to sell it to get enough knowledge about these things in order to actually market it and advertise it as something useful. That's where we actually integrate the traditions in which these indigenous communities actually refer to in this case. They then tell you that indigenous communities won't commercialize it, it's their incentive. I'm just unsure why this is true. Oftentimes the ability for indigenous communities or like minority cultures in society to survive is by actually integrating their culture into a just diverse society and status quo we have now. It's quite globalist. Oftentimes people still see a value in which they actually can sell it as a commodity in order to make people more aware of these cultures. I'm unsure why this is the counterfactual that they wanted to defend about. First, substantive on how commercialization increases accessibility and quality to wellness. Before I move into substantive, sure, I'll take one.
Why are indigenous communities so interested in sharing their culture within other groups or within the modern?
So I'm going to take that late. I'm going to answer that later in the second substantive, but I'll prove why this is like just how commercialization increases accessibility towards quality and to wellness. So what do these things look like when it comes to commercialization? It looks like two things. Firstly, on accessibility, where people are able to purchase these things on the market quite cheaply, or being able to actually find people in the area that teaches us this. Commercializing also means like that it becomes somewhat an alternative to current medicine structures that we have of modern science. But secondly, it looks like being able to have labels on quality. It looks like having labels on products, such as like knowing what the ingredients are there. It's more transparent and consumers are informed. But security regulations and safety protocols, such as like goat yogas having to actually have healthy goats without cataracts in order to prevent users from actually contracting the disease. All these things make sure that the people who actually use it can use it safely and get it easily sold. Why will this happen? In terms of accessibility, the people who provide these services are not just selling at massively expensive prices because it's a type of medication. There's incentive. The incentive lies to have as much people to purchase as possible in order to increase the profits through this way, and to also get awareness by having more people opt into it. It's just comparatively a better business model to begin with. But in terms of security, because it's something new, people might be wary or people might make research into it. That's why there's an incentive for companies or states to realize that consumers do not want to get hurt using this product, or to make sure that they can maximize the quality through it. Why this is important? Because the ability for it to become commercialized is that it has some usage. That means oftentimes people with fringe illnesses or problems that Western medicine can't really solve get more of an ability to opt into these new forms of treatment and wellness to improve their conditions. The commercialization, and it also becomes mainstream also. That's where I get attention from the scientific community to actually use research or actually just find the ways in which to actually help individuals on the ground. You conduct greater research when it becomes normalized for people using it through commercialization. But lastly, regulations make these things safer and less dangerous for people to use it. Less people get harmed using these risks and the benefits can be maximized. The quality of it can be improved by actually setting the regulations from the state. We win this because the impact in which we're able to get from this is that even even if we're able to concede that maybe it's someone's culture, it oftentimes the impact in which we're able to get, which is the safety and the ability for other people to also benefit from this type of medication, significantly outweighs it when we prioritize the general societal worldview of things, because more people will be helped by this. The comparative is that it's often less accessible for people who might want it or need it. You have less of an alternative to save your own body. Maybe you have fringe illnesses that you cannot do so. But in cultures are also kept within your own echo chambers, states often don't really have that much of an incentive to intervene or to make sure that it doesn't cause a risk to a risk that since that just little political capital to be gained from it. But secondly, how do you exactly increase awareness of the culture? I think this directly engages with the proposition claim that people don't want to do it. Firstly, on how do we increase awareness? Because when these products and practices become mainstream, they become commercialized, they become mainstream. So these practices are then popularized in society, where it often creates large amounts of attention by the media, where people actually just want to know what it does and what it looks like. That's why you actually increase in awareness of the cultures. This is because people advertising these cultures now get legitimacy for their products when they actually use the traditional version. It seems like it's the authentic version and the creator is something that's good. But it also looks like corporations also wanting to have good PR in this case, where when they actually just get this form of profit, when they market it as this indigenous community and they generate it, it's good PR for them to actually just give some degree of money back to these communities or to actually provide them credit. But it's also the fact that society right now puts a lot of impact onto who actually owns these things. So even if side proposition can claim that, people it's their culture, there's still a very strong pressure onto individuals on the ground to make sure that credit is given where it's due. Why is it important? Because oftentimes these cultures are quite fringe and are often quite minority. There are dying practices and very little buy-in in society except from their own community. The best way to revive them or keep them alive, which is to preserve on side of proposition, is to also allow more people to actually integrate or buy into the culture. Evolution isn't bad, and it happens just over time. It's a way of different cultures integrating and interacting with each other to adopt their ways of life that's preferable in the name of continuation and preservation. Once these practices have become mainstream, consumers will buy into these everything, all the herbs, stones, and gems. They read about it, they buy everything about it, they travel there to these indigenous places to realize what it looks like. The impact is that it integrates their culture back into society, where you continuously preserve their form of culture and you preserve their way of life. When you have more people buying into it, that's why it actually generate awareness. But it's also the fact that you increase the urgency that it's something that's so good that this culture is actually able to bring something that benefits society. That's why we have an urgency to actually continue preserve these things. That's why we have an obligation for us to actually just keep themselves. It cannot be exclusive on side of proposition when nobody knew these types of wellness practices existed, when nobody buys into it and minorities receive nothing on the comparative. And yet when these people leave after some period of time, your culture will be disintegrated. That's how we protect them. That's how we make it safer. Thank you very much. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Let's now call on Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, I'm fine with any pronouns, and my POI preferences are 3 boys. Yeah, I'll be setting up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think that spiritual wellness is subjective and it is not something that can be copied nor bought. There are 2 questions that I'd like to answer in my speech. Do indigenous people want people to use this? And is this beneficial for the consumers actually? So there are 3 things I'd like to do in my speech. Firstly, I'd like to bring back pieces of my partner's case that they haven't responded to. Secondly, I'd like to bring you an extension on how the capitalization on spiritual wellness is something that is not good. And lastly, I'd like to tell you why we win this debate. But before that, a couple of responses. They tell you that indigenous community do this for benefits. They're not stupid, right? Note that we're not arguing on medical practices. These are spiritual practices that rely on connection to nature and spirituality, not science. So yes, but even if, let's engage on that, some oftentimes this is something that they want to keep within their culture. This is something that is sacred to them, and they probably want to preserve the sanctity within this culture, because necessarily when you make it accessible to a bigger amount of people, they're more likely to misconstrue it just because they're less close to this culture and they're not the origin of this culture. And these benefits are often misconstrued because oftentimes the indigenous people are not the ones in charge of promoting this type of culture. It's the corporations, right? They have to go through this profit-driven third actor, which is not really good because they often misconstrue it for profit, because the indigenous people will not be the ones in charge because they're disenfranchised and they don't have the power to. We think that they tell you that people will market it. People are then likely to understand the purposes. This is not true, since companies would likely just see that they capitalize it and then blow up the benefits in order to get this profit. They're likely to be misconstrued in order to get benefits. They're likely to be sensationalized and adapted to the audience just in order to get that profit, and this actually misconstrues the actual benefits of the rituals that these IP people have. Like, this looks like you do this meditation ritual, therefore now you're able to get much wealth. This is something that seems a lot more appealing to the general audience. They tell you that it fills in the gap of Western medicine, it promotes greater research because more widespread. I don't think we're debating on medicine anyways. This is something that is spiritual and then subjective. They tell you that less people get harmed from using this. People don't get harmed anyways if they don't get to use this. I don't get why there's so much harm from using a rock or using or going to meditation rituals in the first place anyways. And they tell you that it increases awareness, IPs get legitimacy. Why do these indigenous people want validation from other people outside of their group? They probably don't want white girls to dilute their culture and misuse it. So even if you get awareness, we're not quite sure why IPs want this, and this awareness is probably something that isn't good. This is something that is probably diluted and misconstrued in order to get profit. And they tell you that integrates culture back into society. You have to note that there's also a big chance that this actually brings spiritual wellness to the people that are buying this. So at the point of time that these people don't get this spiritual wellness, they're likely to opt out of it, and then they're just like likely to ignore this trend, and this trend dies out, thus like actually preventing the integration of culture back into society. So why is it most important that we protect the vulnerable indigenous people then? Because we think that indigenous people are already disenfranchised. These cultures and traditions are obviously very important to them and sacred to these indigenous people. When it becomes something that is accessible to a vast majority, this is more prone to dilution and misinterpretation. It also becomes less valuable and lessens the sanctity of it just because a lot of people are now part of this sacred practice or whatever. It becomes something that people use to make money off of, which you think is principally unjust. You take away meaningful culture that is very important for indigenous people. What's the problem then? The problem is people profit off of this delusion and deception of consumers. What's our counterfactual then? Our counterfactual is just let these practices proliferate, which is likely to happen because indigenous people will want to continue these cultures regardless of profit or not. And we think that people have their own conceptions of spiritual wellness anyways, because they don't have to rely on like these other forms of spiritual wellness that have been made by indigenous people. So we're okay with these practices not being popular anyways, because our culture is not for everyone's enjoyment and not for people's profit. And we think that probably that the spiritual processes behind these practices will not work because people won't have connection to this nature that IPs have. People do it as a trend. They don't necessarily know that much about it. They don't necessarily understand the meaning and processes behind it. It's less likely to work because you can't say that it's just based in belief, because that's invalidating IP people, right? But even if this is true, these people probably believe in this less than IP. They probably just wanted to try it out. Thus, it's less likely to work. Oh, my extension then on why it's bad to capitalize on spiritual wellness. We think that spiritual wellness isn't something that you can necessarily buy. You can't promise your consumer spiritual wellness just by giving them a crystal or promising them a meditation ritual, and then you automatically get spiritual wellness. Pseudoscience happens when business people try to claim that certain practices have benefits that are not backed by science. And we think that at the point in time in which you make these things more widespread, this is also bad because these may be subject to more criticism. This is something that IPs don't want. We think that you're going to get a lot of criticism when these things don't necessarily work for people, and this is likely to happen because spiritual wellness is subjective. And we think that it's gonna get challenged by other means in which you get spiritual wellness, i.e. the church. Like, because this happens because even if people are subscribed to a religion, they still want to try these things out because they're necessarily trendy or whatnot. They're probably gonna, what happens then if this becomes accessible and widespread, the church is probably gonna paint this as something like witchcraft. This is necessarily harmful to the IP culture because the church would now have to probably take several mitigation efforts because now people are finding spiritual wellness and other things than the church, right? We think that spiritual wellness is also subjective. Different things work for different people. These practices don't work for everyone. Of course, these practices work for the indigenous people, but for the local citizen, for the average Joe, it probably won't, right? Some people find it from religion. And these practices provide spiritual wellness from indigenous people. It's not like the reason why people seek the spiritual wellness, that because they it's not likely the reason that people want the spiritual wellness, that they seek out these trends. It's probably because it's accessible and it's a trend, right? This looks like people probably wouldn't buy crystals if it wasn't popular on TikTok. If people want to seek the same kind of spiritual wellness, we'd rather have them go through the root of this culture rather than accessing it through commercial means. And we're not locking people out of spiritual wellness anyways, because there are many other ways in which you can access this spiritual wellness for free, and something that doesn't enfranchise the indigenous people. This looks like exercise, meditation, praying, practicing your religion, and spending meaningful time with your loved ones. These other methods are probably more meaningful and have more solid impacts than having your spiritual wellness depend on a ritual and crystals, right? This looks like actively doing something to improve spiritual wellness rather than, okay, I'll take the POI.
Why is there an incentive for corporations to sell something that doesn't work or to misadvertise it to make it less authentic? And why do indigenous communities on our side cannot practice their own culture even if it's commercialized?
They can practice their own culture, but like of course they're gonna get insulted if they see other people outside of their culture that are diluting and misusing this culture. And like the companies are likely to sell this, but of course it works, but it's not going to work for everyone. So like there's still the harm that it won't work for everyone. They're likely to get criticism, and people will back out of this. So okay, on to my point. This looks like actively doing something to improve spiritual wellness rather than relying on the rock. This looks like people relying on their prayer for happiness while not doing anything about it. So I think that even if people get spiritual wellness, it shouldn't be just something that is capitalized on, because it's principally unjust. It isn't very long term. And spiritual wellness is something that you necessarily work towards, not something that you just buy and steal off the people. And we think that your own conception of spiritual wellness, something that you work towards, is probably better than just buying a crystal or going to a meditation ritual that is essentially just copying off of someone. So even if you make it accessible and even if you integrate culture, I don't think this is something that the indigenous people necessarily want, because they believe that these cultures is sacred and something that should be practiced by their community and something that should be kept within the community. And I don't think that cultural appropriation should happen. So for all of those reasons and more, please propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Let's now call on the Leader for position.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Just give me 1 second. Pull up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, side government's entire case functions on two gross mischaracterizations. A, that these cultures will be misconstrued, and B, that these cultures were created to be embraced by the individuals within them and no one else. We see side opposition was the only house willing to engage with their worst case and trade it off. You never hear any analysis from side government whatsoever as to why, even in their worst instance, their culture might be like accepted properly, and why in their worst instance, like indigenous people would want to share their culture. But very quickly, panel, what has commercialization looked like so far, and why has it been inherently good? We say this debate was about two things. A, has this been a good or bad thing for the cultures that propagated said beliefs? And B, why are said practices likely to be legitimate, and why should they be accessed by people on the ground? Why the natural opt-in to modern therapy, essentially, and medicine needs to exist? We told you exclusively that not every individual is willing to opt into modern medicine. Not every individual like accepts modern medicine as well. We say this natural therapy needs to exist, and only in our they exist within a safe environment. Very quickly, panel, with that being said, our burden is simple. The moment we prove A, that these methods were effective and safe and regulated, and B, that exclusively you benefit your minority cultures by practicing their practices and raising awareness of their cultures in our, we win. God needs to retrospectively tell you why said practices have been inherently harmful for these cultures and are not likely to be effective. But very quickly on their engagement, you heard no analysis to Yang Ming's POI as to why if this culture and their practice is inherently good, individuals won't improve it and research on it if there's like actual value behind it. They only wanted to debate in a vacuum where your culture will be misconstrued, where this like new version of this culture is going to be bad, and why then it's going to be seen as a scam. But very quickly, what wasn't responded to? You really had no responses to how commercialization increases accessibility and the quality to wellness in our world, or how we increase wellness about the culture. The only engagement you hear was this repetitive analysis as to why the culture was misconstrued and how you take away from the minorities who practice this culture. So very quickly, let's deal with this. Just some rebuttals that don't fit. First of all, on some framing, because we hear from them that these practices are heavily misunderstood and it's not deculture. The outcome that they say is that deculture will continue anyway in their work, just to a much lower scale. The response is simple. Framing is the only layer of analysis from them that we hear as to why it shouldn't be commercialized. They say gross mischaracterization, but in the majority of instances, they actually look like things like acupuncture, like methods of meditation, practices with solid science, traditional medicine, exclusively in our effective regulation and practice as a result of communication. It was just a wash to say pseudoscience because these are things that actually go back to like your nerve endings. These are things that actually go back to the human anatomy. We literally take down all the analysis Gov had as to why it shouldn't be commercialized, as it will be appropriate and hence framed as a sham. Even if misunderstood, commercialization means you have fact checking because you have many actors within this industry. You have like the average individual on Reddit, you have other companies, fact tracking through social media, forums on the internet, inquiries like into companies, right? Essentially mean that there is clear incentive to actually be a genuine vendor of business because like trends show that your profits in being there long term and being genuine are huge. Anyways, second point of argument second point of response I have, I'll take you right after this. They talk about how commercialization means it's associated with trends as opposed to indigenous and like people, and they're like going to stop opting into it. Now they see it as a sham, and how like awareness is going to go down because incentive to opt into like it among society goes down and creates a bad image of the culture. The response is simple. The only response we hear as to why this is bad is the result of the crystal hype on TikTok. Like this is the one instance as to why this is bad. Recognize this is largely because of how this has been romanticized on TikTok to like give you what you want. The perverse narrative made it commercialized, not the other way around. Don't let them get away with that, panel. We told you that the majority of examples are incredibly legitimate, with roots in early medicine and a deep understanding of human anatomy, further accelerating the like respect existent for these cultures. Every single harm you heard on Gov was premised upon this crystal example. Their whip needs to tell you why this exclusively applies to the other examples, even that I think it's a bit too late to bring in that new substantive. Additionally, if we take their case realistically at its very best, the crystal case isn't just seen as much of a sham. They're legitimate businesses who actually sell your crystals and actively take like away from the culture, right? This goes to say the meaning of different crystals and whether they align with you or not, which gives us a huge appreciation for traditional like Chinese culture and narratives like feng shui. Before that, I'll take you PY. Defend yourself.
Note that we're debating on spiritual wellness, not medical. So given that, what's the science behind meditation retreats, healing crystals, and nature rituals?
I think the answer is simple, right? Like literally, if you go like into nature and you like reset your breathing patterns, it's all incredibly like beneficial to your metabolism, to how you feel, to how your brain reacts. There's like legit science behind it. It's weird that you guys are debating this and haven't brought that up yet. But just a key clarification to me: why are we okay with profiting off the culture, and why are we okay with cultural dissolution? It's very worse. First layer is the problem that these cultures face in status quo. Recognize you're actively losing relevance. These practices are often seen as some that are like too disciplined and extreme. For example, drinking ashes mixed with water in like Taoist culture, or fasting for extended periods of time. As a result, the opt-in from newer generations and new individuals is low. These cultures are dying, and unfortunately, with them, many of their beautiful practices. I'll go on to talk about why their purpose is to keep and preserve their practices. Secondly, for this, why are we okay with profiting off it? You'll hear later on my argument why the narrative of many of these cultures and their principle of the collective good should persist in that everyone should be able to buy into it, and that it's a great alternative to modern medicine. But secondly, the best way to do this is to commercialize it, because in that way, you're able to regulate it and make it a safe opt-in. The comparative is simple. What is the inherent harm of someone's like monetary gain if they enable you to opt into the culture, for example, through classes, seminars, etc.? Even at worst, if Gov argues like it's overhyped and hence overvalued, we are completely okay with it. The comparative is literally you have the very small practice of the culture versus this commercialized culture. You're going to hear this in my argument in a second. But secondly, commercialized culture is inherently better because the awareness to a certain extent and individuals practicing like forms of the culture throughout is way better versus your world, like where thousands of years of sacrifice and heritage often eventually fades or lacks influence in bettering the lives of individuals on the ground. We think the value of your culture comes from not just practices, but how widely it's practiced and how it's able to fulfill its initial purpose of helping for the collective good. C, what does cultural dissolution in our world look like, and why are we really cool with it? Because, like, for example, within Taoist culture, you do extreme things like bring ash and water. For many, the extreme nature of this culture and the fact that it's barely practiced in your world make it a hard opt-in and a deterring factor. We say you still keep the roots of the culture, which is the crucial nuance in our world, but you dilute its extremely like stringent nature for like just making it easier to buy in. For example, you can like meditate, but you don't have to fast for like 30 days, which a lot of Buddhist monks do. Methods are still incredibly effective and natural, but better and easier to opt in for the average person. We still preserve the culture and leave room for individuals to embrace it further. Why is this important? in. Panel, the only crucial harms you heard from the Gulf case were that like you dilute culture and commercialization is bad. We exclusively tell you why culture was about creating buy-in to actually survive and preserve their like rich practices. Gulf's metric was preserving the inherent value of this culture. But panel, we proved to you that the comparative was simple. You either get a very small practice culture versus commercialized culture. Take your pick, especially when we proved to you commercialized culture is regulated and still keeps the crucial nuance of this culture. But then a very quick argument on the principal good. Culture frequently is centered, these cultures is frequently centered upon helping those in need and guiding them in the direction meant for them. We see to take away the accessibility from so many and enable your culture to die, we throw away those thousands of years and drain like just this culture of its rich practice and inherent values to society. It is the only way to access the only way to access it was in commercialized manner. We were cool with that because we weren't willing to throw this inherent value of this culture away. That's literally why you have like Buddhist monks and Native Americans who promote the beauty of their culture through like seminars like Dalai Lama or cultural fairs or like Sadhguru and like Hinduism, right? The narrative of keeping it to themselves made no sense whatsoever, which is why we just take out everything that like second speaker coming from Gulf said. PM told me that the loss of support through the masses was a society, like massive society was a trade-off they were willing to make. But then from DPM, you hear really weirdly that they want to keep their culture to themselves and they want to make the trade-off. That was never a harm they were trying to like make in the first place. So a huge case incoherency. But clearly it's a mischaracterization of what your culture looks like. They're often created to help others. Second speaker's argument was a wash. We effectively took down everything they've said thus far. Panel, we take today's debate like inherently because we proved to you that ALP's framing was just simply untrue and proved to you that most of the time these cultures want to persist and are inherently good for humanity. I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader for Opposition. Let's now call on Government Whip.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. For pronouns, it's she, her. Let me just set my timer. Okay. So for POIs, feel free to unmute yourselves because I won't be looking at the chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think it's been very clear coming from our first speaker that the main interest of indigenous communities is self-fulfillment. They'll be able to practice these sacred traditions within their own space. I don't get why they have to spread this kind of culture towards white people, all right, or like to other groups in the modern world. But even if we take them at their best, that awareness is important. I don't get why commercialization is the only way for these practices to proliferate. The only thing coming from the previous speaker is because commercialization leads to regulation. Another important question that I want to impose, right? Why is regulation so important when it comes to these spiritual wellness practices? It is so odd to me because I really don't get, are these spiritual wellness practices so harmful in the first place that they need this kind of regulation? Were they really unsafe that they need this kind of security for other people to practice them? Doesn't acupuncture already have like a proper education already for them to like work in the first place? I know this because like even if like anecdotal piece of evidence, I have relatives who are acupuncturists, even if they are not well commercialized into the modern world, they've already been taught like by education, by spiritual wellness instructors anyway. I think there's already some kind of regulation going on. But even if commercialization, I really don't think that commercialization equals legitimization of these certain practices. Because if you want to argue about acupuncture and these other things, we think that this already been very legitimate, even without being like especially commercialized or advertised in the market. Because we see that acupuncture is very like legitimized by the World Health Organization, even without it being seen as a very popular thing in the market or in platforms for white people. I think it's still very absurd as to why commercialization is the only way for legitimization. But secondly, we win this debate.
Yeah.
Sure, I'll get your PI. I'll take your PI.
This is not an active debate, so we're debating in a general societal worldview. So long as you also recognize the fact that acupuncture benefits a large amount of people on the ground, why is that you're willing to take the trade-off then?
I think that's very unsure. I think we're the only team who's actually been very clear in giving to you certain standards in this House regrets motion. We gave you first why this has been very harmful in the past. Obviously, we use the healing crystals example because it's been the most major things misconstrued and been very harmful to these indigenous communities. But secondly, like But secondly, we tell you why a counterfactual is still better. We're willing to take the trade-off that sure, even if this kind of awareness is lower, even if like people people won't be that woke about these certain practices, at least the ones who know about this practice truly want to invest in that kind of culture. But thirdly, we tell you why there's more harm than good coming from your side. I think we actually fulfill to the true spirit of this motion, but we win because we're able to like not engage, we're able to like not, you know, be in this idealistic world that Gov supposedly thinks it is in, because we tell you the incentive structures of certain companies. We tell you that commercialization looks like profit incentivized companies endorsing these products into larger platforms for white people mostly. We tell you it looks like, you know, going on Shopee or Lazada and selling these kinds of things that promote spiritual wellness. We tell you that spiritual wellness is subjective. It's not a thing that can be bought. And we tell you that obviously companies are going to like try to, you know, do it in a way that people are going to be interested in it. I'm going to be like responding to what like obviously the first speaker said about companies have the responsibility to properly promote it and stuff like that, and how like corporations give back to like indigenous communities, which I think is so absurd because I don't think this really happens. I really don't think that corporations try to like get permission from indigenous communities to like promote their certain practices. I just think they just promote it and just they don't give back at all. I think this happens really in status quo. But firstly, so we tell you that even if their entire case that hinges upon having awareness and having appreciation towards these kinds of cultures and them reintegrating in the real world, first we tell you that these indigenous communities don't care about that. And secondly, we tell you that commercialization isn't the only way. We think that it's already going to be very late for the RIP to answer this kind of question. But firstly, we win in this debate because we're able to like answer, be more clear in like, you know, answering the main issues of this debate. Firstly, on like messaging of commercialization, I think it's already been very fair, the analysis given to by my partners, and how people often misinterpret culture, especially in a large platform. We tell you, like characteristically, people in the modern world or people engaged in capitalism are usually white people, are usually like people who rarely understand minority groups, right? We tell you that then what these companies will do is much more likely to do is to sell these ways inauthentically or fake. We tell you that there is no that the companies don't care how they sell their services. As long as it's like, okay, sure, I'll take it.
The only way for a company to sell something that is new is to make it authentic or to make it seem legit. Given that the only avenue of information is via the traditional knowledge that they accrue from research, why then is that misrepresentation? And why is that incentive to make it fake?
Okay. Very untrue. Like, come on, like we see here that we don't really know the exact origin of where these services or practices came from. No one really knows the exact origin of acupuncture. You have to search at Harvard to know where it comes from. So when, like, for example, companies try to promote these kinds of things, they won't exactly be close to the book, or they won't exactly be close to the original intent of why these practices originate, right? We tell you that even if like companies wanted to be authentic, these practices will be diluted by the consumers anyway. And we tell you that even if you get awareness, it's still very harmful because Ivan already tells you that when profit is involved, the awareness that you get is very short term, because when these practices or these spiritual wellness practices, they become like a trend. When it's not a trend anymore, people are going to disengage from it. But secondly, we tell you it's very, very harmful for you to let other people or people outside of community try to familiarize yourself with your culture, because more often than not, a lot of conservative people are going to label it as something wrong or label it as witchcraft. It's going to pose more harm to indigenous communities, and we see this happening with a lot of religious people saying that these kinds of practices are witchcraft, or these kinds of practices are so unauthentic or inaccurate. Then we tell you, like, for example, this happens in minority groups, for example, where, like, for example, Black communities prepare their food differently from white people, and white people try to correct them and say that's so weird and gross. Black communities would then say that we don't care if you don't like our culture, it's our culture. So these kinds of things is something that indigenous communities don't care about if other white people care about what they do. But secondly, where are indigenous communities better off? We tell you that they're better to enforce their culture without commercialization, because at the very least, we can tell you that indigenous communities can promote these kinds of culture themselves in a bottom-up approach. We tell you this happens anyway, right? Even without commercialization. And even if we take the trade-off and bite the bullet that sure, it's going to take very short term, sure, a lot of people, less people are going to be familiar with it. At the very least, they're able to at least get to that goal or that standard where they're going to be more self-fulfilled. Okay, so going on to my third, the third issue of awareness. How is this going to happen exactly, even without commercialization? Because I'm going to engage with the world with a case coming from opposition. We tell you that processes or certain structures still take place even without commercialization. We tell you that these cultures aren't exactly dying. We tell you there are many Chinatown communities who have stores for acupuncture, who have stores for these kinds of practices that people are still going to be able to opt into, especially people who genuinely want to engage with these practices, not because they're a trend posted by certain corporations. We tell you there are still processes and structures that take place that genuinely promote these practices well. We think that, right? So, and we tell you that in the case of regulation, we told you it's not really that important because then up is trying to admit that there's already harm to these practices in the first place, which is very, very untrue, very, very absurd. So if you want to go to the side that actually tells you how to best promote these practices, or what really is the interest of these indigenous communities, go for side government. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip. Let's now call on Opposition Whip.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Nice. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think it's extremely funny for side government to keep talking about acupuncture and then saying that they find acupuncture in areas like Chinatown, right? What that means is literally she's conceding the fact that the culture of acupuncture has become commercialized, right? It has become so commercialized to the point where it's so accessible to everyone that everyone has integrated that the fact acupuncture that comes from this specific culture, from Chinese culture, is now integrated to anyone's lives, right? To any part of the world. Chinatown that happens in USA, Chinatown in UK, Chinatown in basically everywhere, right? The acupuncture shops are going to be there. This form of colonization is what keeps culture going. This form of colonization is what preserves this form of culture, right? And then today in my speech, I bring to you two important things, right? First, I'll deal with the issue that which side generates more awareness, and second, I'll tell you which side can minorities are much, or society is much more better off in a collective sense, right? Because what are the two main stakeholders in today's debate, right? The thing that the two main stakeholders is number one, collective society, and number two, other indigenous people themselves, right? We think that in order to win today's debate is to prove to you, and the first factor is that whether we can generate awareness and help these minorities, and secondly, how can we actually collectively benefit society as a whole with these useful cultures and practices in the very first place, right? So onto the point of which side can generate more awareness, right? Number one is first appealing to the public, right? Notice how commercialization can only happen when you properly do things like R&D is properly done, right? To make things more safe, or regulations implemented to make things more safe, right? Notice that awareness can only be created when you pick people's interest in the very first place, right? You have to make sure it's more than just a trend, right? It's tell people to say that, oh, this is something interesting, I want to find out more about it. They're going to start searching about it, right? Because the moment of which you're curious about it, when it's currently not, cause it's currently trending, it's much more than that, right? You don't just buy a random crystal for no reason on Lazada, right? You obviously have to find out more about what is this crystal, where is it from, what culture is it from, right? And now when people find out, it's like, hey, this crystal comes from this specific culture, then are you more like to buy into or opt into their culture to find out everything about it, to buy everything about it, to find out everything about it, to if not travel to those areas to actually embrace properly their culture, right? I'll take a POI later, right? Because we think that this is the form of important awareness that government lacks in their case, right? Because this is the type of awareness that helps preserve this culture. Because notice the point at which where R&D development is being done on it and regulations are being implemented, this things that legitimization of these cultures are properly done, right? The culture preservation and integration is one that's more likely to happen, right? These are key important factors and something that's missing inside proposition. Because we can't just say that, oh, the own minorities are going to practice their own culture, right? Notice how this doesn't prevent and stop dying cultures. Because notice things like urgency is extremely important, right? Things like brain drain in these cultures right now, right? Because in order to find for you a future, that many of these young individuals from these cultures are now leaving to go to these towns and no longer continuing the lineage of centuries of these cultures, right? Because the thing that props alternatives in today's debate to protect these cultures is to do literally nothing other than saying that, hey, you should go and practice yourselves and maybe you should save it on your own, right? We think the problem of the reason reason why they just cannot save themselves is number one, brain drain is very happening right now on their world. We think number two is that nobody really cares about them, nobody really knows about them. We think that the only way for you to save this is from true proper integration and proper preservation that is only exclusive under opposition, right? So now onto the point of things like cultural appropriation, because side government is saying that, or side proposition is saying, they're arguing that corporations oftentimes don't ask permissions or or ask minorities to come and work in the project, right? So oftentimes this is not a very smart business move. This is not a very strategic business move. Why is this so, right? It's like they're saying things like, oh, I'm going to sell medicine, but I'm going to let Gordon Ramsay do it, right? That's not going to work. That just doesn't work, right? So sure, you're going to get your gourmet pills or whatnot, right? But it's not going to be effective. Neither is it going to be authentic, right? So oftentimes what corporations are more likely to do is that they actually get people who know what they're doing to actually do the job for them, right? We think that the trade-off here is that sure, we may alter extreme or harmful parts of these extreme cultures, things like acupuncture, who goes to extreme methods to literally prick you deep down inside, versus now moderate versions of acupuncture where you still have the core of it is still going to be there, but it's still acupuncture at its core. And right now, right, this is the reason why this leads to things like commercialization, right? It's the research and development things, right, that can propagate from these, right? What does it look like, right? Things like hot springs, just the simple virtue of you like dipping yourself in the hot water has literally prop up things like research and development, saying that it's deemed to have actual medical properties from these hot springs, right? I think not only that, things like regulation, right, to stop toxic and dangerous practices that sometimes go along with these like very good cultures, right? We think what this does, number one, you give better images of these indigenous cultures, right? Because oftentimes many of these indigenous communities are disenfranchised because they are being seen as brutes, savages, uneducated people. These are the terrible stereotypes being in place on them. But when you try to integrate them back into society, and when you try to give them a proper sense of regulation, saying that, oh, their culture is safe, and these people who know what they're doing, they're trying to help you, they're trying to protect you with the new cultures. This is when you try to change their image. This is when you start enfranchising them again, right? This is when you try to protect them, which leads perfectly to my next substantive, right? Which side are minorities and society better off, right? Before I go on even more, I'll take a POI if there's any. 3, 2, 1. Okay, seeing there's no PR, I can move on, right? Because let's first talk about the enfranchisement of these individuals. I've been talking a lot about how they're enfranchised, but how are they actually done? Because we think that Viral and Yang Ming's speech has made it very clear that when you commercialize their own cultures and products, this is when money is being funneled back to minorities, right? This is where money is being sent to them. We think that even with the middleman in the middle of these big corporations, we think at least a substantive amount of money is being transferred to these individuals. Because the comparative here is that inside government, nothing is being done. No money is being transferred to them. They're not being popularized. Their entire culture is going to die out at one point, right? But on the outside, we at least prevent, at the worst case scenario, prevent large amount of these problems, right? Because we think that oftentimes these are unheard indigenous minorities, right? Who are oftentimes also financially crippled. They live in the middle of nowhere, very bad sanitation. They don't really have much accessibility towards them, right? We think the point at which when you start to commercialize them, this means that you also put a mark on the map, right? We think this also does things like, making them being noticed by the government, right? Forcing governments to push on subsidies towards these individuals to actually make them give a damn about these indigenous people in the very first place, right? We think this also leads down to other trickle-down effects, such as prevention of discrimination or a sense of urgency to commercialize or make these things very important in society, right? Because we think that it leads to a second part, right? Internalizing or being proud of your own culture. Notice how when someone else practices your culture, sometimes when someone else celebrates Christmas or celebrates Chinese New Year, you feel happy about it, right? Like, why not, right? People are celebrating your culture. It's a good thing. You should be proud of it, right? Because we think that the principle of this is that commercialization happens when there's an inherent value in your culture, right? Because if they see your culture as something that brings people together, brings people happiness, or even increases your health or life expectancy, this is something that you can be proud of. This is something that has inherent value, right? Because you commercialize something that has inherent value, this means society is more likely to benefit towards these things, right? Because we tell trends, these are not just trends, right? As side government has labeled them. This is more than just a trend, right? We think that these spiritual wellness products is one that are eventually going to cement themselves and integrate into our culture and society, right? In our everyday lives, right? We think there's something like seeing acupuncture or massages and everything with specific techniques and whatnot, right, from different types of cultures. We think this is eventually going to be integrated in society. This is then, going to go through all these R&D procedures to make sure how beneficial it is towards the entirety of society, right? We think it's a good culture. If something is so good, it should be rather be shared to the world. This is the collective benefit that side government fails to see and fails to get under their side, right? I think these are all exclusive benefits to you. Because Because what I've proven to you, right? Within a point in which you garner awareness and you garner some sense of agency and preservation of these cultures, this is when can you only allow enfranchisement of these individuals and integrate them back to society. And not only that, we are more likely to give a collective benefit for society as a whole, right? When they're giving you all of these structural benefits, we think opposition has taken today's debate.
Thank you. Opposition whip. Let's now call an opposition reply.
I just checking if I'm audible.
Yeah, you're.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, proposition, for the very great debate. Right. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm gonna be really clear. Selling something is already commercialization. That means his prop is okay with their acupuncture service shops in Chinatown, and they basically concede the entire roots of their case. I'm gonna do 3 things. Firstly, whether or not these things and treatments are useful. Proposition tells you that it's spiritual, so it's not medical. Opposition already frames this out. If there's just really no usage in life or there's no value in the market, it's not really going to even be sold, or people aren't going to be buying this. That means to say the harms of your spiritual and your own belief system isn't going to be harmed to the extent. But then they tell you that it's very subjective and it works for certain people. So if it's so, that means that it still has some usage. But also, opposition also tells you that we don't think this specifically responds to the opt claim, that exactly why this directly benefits individuals on the ground. That's why you have people who opt out of modern medicine because they can't actually be palatable to it and try to solve their illnesses. That's why increase the probability in which individuals can actually be helped. But also, if there is a benefit in this, this actually encourages and this incentivizes individuals in the scientific community to take more attention, to look into it, to increase the chances of success, or to make it as palatable to everybody as possible. This conclusion to this entire clash is that yes, it has benefits and it helps people, and it encourages research into it. That means there's a larger impact that's able to benefit the greater amount of society, is collectively important, because if you're able to benefit a greater demographic of status quo, is a worthy trade-off on our side of the house. But this also shows that there's been a precedence of becoming mainstream, such as acupuncture or yoga, meditation. I think also response to prop, that's just a trend and won't last long. Secondly, whether indigenous communities are misrepresented. They tell that white girls on TikTok are going to misrep it. The response we gave them was that entirely unresponded to, was that this is a new thing to modern society. That means to say, for you to sell it and for people to buy it, you need to make it as authentic or to as legitimate as possible in order for customers to actually just have a second look or to think about even buying it. The only response that was replied by Guff Whip, who I quote, very, very untrue, because white people don't know about crystals, this response has already been very unintuitive, because if people don't know about crystals to begin with, why would they even sell them? But then they tell that Chinese people also have acupuncture shops in Chinatown, so it's okay, you can still share their culture and represent them, which technically is commercialization, so I don't really get why then the impact of misrepresentation is that significant on prop case. The clash to this concludes that sure, maybe we water down some fringe variations of these cultures, but the core and genuinity of this culture is still able to be protected, hence cultural appropriation and misrepresentation isn't that significant, but able to set safety regulations, which are far more important for consumers on the ground. But lastly, our indigenous communities heard. They tell you that other religions will shame you. Look, if this thing works and help people, there isn't going to be that much backlash. This is like what Guff Zoot's own relatives do, which technically does acupuncture and doesn't really get backlash and hate from people. But moreover, I think because there exactly is value in your treatment, people are more inclined to believe that they want to protect this culture and this tradition to continue this flow, but also to go through research and be aware of your own, your significant culture in this case, in order for them to actually just find better ways in which they can actually implement this. This is how we actually increase the awareness of individuals. But this is why you also have an incentive to actually launch PR campaigns by corporations to make sure that we're able to give these individuals credit, but to also actually just provide some degree of money in order to whitewash what they've done. But if it's true that this is the harms that they want to talk about, the harms that opposition brings, but the entire dissolution of the culture, where people in these indigenous communities are leaving for better futures in the modern world, where they are unwilling to continue these practices without it being mainstream, where they believe that these things are too dangerous or that are just too risky, and they just aren't willing to sacrifice anything for it. By making it secure and making it safe, we increase the ability in which individuals in these communities in the future are also more able to buy into this. The conclusion to this clash and the conclusion to this entire debate is that we acknowledge that minority cultures have always had a hard time surviving in status quo. I have also experienced that as a Chinese Malaysian in my own country. That's why we ought to integrate our cultures, and that's why we ought to fight to make our culture mainstream in society in order to continue it, in order to preserve it for a greater good of collective society. That's why we stand on opposition in this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, opposition reply. Let's now call on government reply.
I'll just set up my timer. All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Share, notice how throughout this entire speech, or throughout this entire round, opposition kept trying to leverage themselves by repeatedly mischaracterizing the motion. The vast majority of examples that they have given you to try and to justify their arguments and their impole claims, such as acupuncture, are purely rooted with science. They are, even if they try to tell us that those fall under the category of spiritual practices, they are outliers where people actually can understand their meanings and original sources because it already has enough backing from both legitimate sources as well as scientific ones. Now again, notice how the entire case is contingent on examples like acupuncture, which is debatable if it is even a part of the motion. Whereas our entire case have used the examples given by the motion itself, such as meditation rituals, crystals, as well as other rituals practiced from or like taken off from indigenous people. Indigenous next, they try and tell us that indigenous communities don't care about what people think about them. Chair, they don't really need the validation. They don't need their culture to become mainstream. All they want is for people to respect it. Communities who have these practices, and take note that communities who have these practices aren't really dying out. Again, as the examples that we have already told you, there are members like there are exceptions such as Chinatown and small communities dispersed all over different areas of the world. And these practices don't need research and development or improvement or regulation. Again, this derives the practice from original culture and implies that these practices are harmful to begin with. And they kept trying to assume that the consumers who opt into these practices are going to start to do an extensive research before they even buy the product. Or I don't think this is likely because again, companies can easily just because my partner has already said that these companies can easily just mislead them. This is already something that they haven't really responded to. Take note that the issues that have come up on how indigenous people are protected and on how these cultures are preserved, as well as the commercialization, have all been one. They tell you that they want indigenous people want cultural preservation. This can be done through preserving their own communities because this is part of their own identity and it's sacred to them. People are likely to misconstrue their culture and have different interpretations of it at the point in which you make it accessible by making it commercialized. Even if we don't do anything to promote this culture, we're perfectly fine with this because these cultures aren't necessarily dying when there isn't really any outside influence introduced into it. These IPs don't necessarily want other people to share their culture because it's such an important part of identity. Op kept on trying to tell you on one of these issues, such as companies, they will tell you that the companies will preserve this culture. This once again assumes that companies are like altruistic in their nature. They assume that businesses will immediately ask permission from indigenous people. This doesn't happen. This doesn't happen in the vast majority of cases. Whereas they kept on trying to assume a very idealistic world because in the, and they kept on saying that these companies will have to make sure that these products are authentic. Again, as my partners already said, this isn't likely to be true because companies who are very much profit oriented and have enough capital to do so can easily just fake it because since nobody really has a lot of extensive knowledge in these cultures. And because of this, it's likely that these practices, or at the very least, the principled meaning of it, will be diluted by the consumers. And on commercialization, again, they kept on telling you that this is better because people can regulate the harms of these practices. DPM, however, tells you that will be no harms anyways if people outside this community don't practice this. And that's for spiritual practices. How is a ritual or some crystals going to essentially harm you right off the bat? Again, finally, spiritual wellness is subjective. It really wouldn't work for everyone. And at a time in which these people don't get the benefits or like the advertised benefits of these spiritual practices, they're likely to opt out of it, and it's likely not to get the benefit of what they said to be the appreciation of culture. For all these reasons and more, never been more proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, government reply. Thank you, debaters. You may now virtually cross the house and kindly leave this room for the main room and wait for the announcements. Thank you.